So I'm very humbled to preach today because it's a topic that I think about and that means something to me, and I get to share that today. So thank you for this opportunity to share something that's part of my journey and something that's part of what I would like to learn and grow from. So I'm going to start by kind of exercising our minds. So I want you to take a moment and focus as I'm telling you this story, and picture yourself in this story, okay? There's a long day of heavy rain, and you finally see that it stopped, and you said, okay, I'm going to go for a walk. And I'm going to go for a walk, I'm going to go on a trail, I'm going to kind of check things out, and you see this beautiful cluster of mushrooms. Maybe you don't think mushrooms are beautiful, but depends on who you're walking with. We think mushrooms can be very beautiful. And you're walking, you're observing, you're thinking, I wonder what kind this is. I wonder if it's good to eat. And this lady with her dog comes and tells you, some of those are poisonous. And you say, yeah, I know. And then she goes and adds afterwards, some can kill you, They're that poisonous. And the conversation just kind of ends. And what happens? She didn't hear you. She not only felt the need to tell you, but made it difficult to respond in a positive manner. So maybe it offends you. And I tried to show you her tone was kind of telling, this telling approach rather than asking. And what happened? It actually prevented a moment to build a positive connection or communication. Now, maybe her motivation was good. Her motivation was to try and be helpful, but sometimes we find when you just tell someone something, it's not very helpful. And maybe we wished in that moment, I wish she kind of asked me, or asked me some questions. Maybe after I said, I know that they're poisonous, instead of telling me something more. So that was a little example I wanted to share of what it could look like to just someone comes and tells you something. How did that make you feel? Think about that a bit. Maybe you felt annoyed, maybe frustrated, probably awkward, and you didn't want to really continue the conversation, let alone build a connection. How could this have gone differently? Maybe we can ask something like, what are you looking at? Or, why is this so interesting to you that you stopped and wanted to look? Or, do you want to learn more about it? Or, what can you tell me about it? So right away you start to see, this is an interesting opportunity to build a connection. Okay, I'll give you another example. So think about this now. There's a man who's studying for a very important financial exam. And he's in his basement study, and he explicitly instructed his 6-year-old daughter, do not interrupt me while I'm studying. He was deep in his work, and all of a sudden he hears a knock on the door announcing the arrival of his 6-year-old daughter, and he says sharply, I thought I told you not to interrupt me. And maybe he even didn't have such an aggressive tone, but he said it simply. And what happens? The daughter bursts into tears and runs off. The next morning, the wife, not very happy with him for upsetting their daughter, but then he defended himself vigorously, and he said, but I said, and she interrupted him and said, I sent her down to you just to tell you good night and ask you if you wanted a cup of coffee to help you with your studying. Why did you tell her or yell at her instead of asking her why she was there? So a couple of examples to just show you the impact and the difference between telling versus asking, or asking a question. And how can we be better? How can we do this better? So there is a book that I read, and it's called, I think it was this one. I'm going to get it confused, but there's 2 books that I have that if anyone's interested, you can come find me after. This one's called Humble Inquiry. And the answer here that's given is the answer to how we can do better is simple, but the implementation may not be. We have to do 3 things. 1, do less telling. 2, learn to do more asking in the form of a humble inquiry. And 3, do a better job of listening and acknowledging. So with my little introduction today, I wanted to share what my hypothesis is, or thesis statement, let's say. I think that in order for us to learn to communicate better and build positive relationship, let's say as effective as Jesus, we must learn the gentle art of asking questions. And Ed Sheen, the author of this book, he called it Humble Inquiry. And he talks a little bit about how in society today, actually, if you think back, why are we this way, especially in North America? We are actually taught to look for answers and not how to ask questions. So we almost need to relearn this skill. We know the basics of how to ask questions, like who, what, when, where, why, that kind of stuff, but maybe it's a little bit ineffective. Now, how did I come to this conclusion? Well, if we don't ask good questions, then we maybe have weak or poor conversations, maybe not so deep. And then with poor conversations, we actually can't really build good relationships. And then relationships won't even be able to grow or be built. And they fall apart, or maybe they can't even form. And so why does this matter? Why do I care so much about this? Well, personal relationships are today crumbling and suffering. Marriages are falling apart. Families are falling apart. Friends are breaking up. Why? And I think one of the reasons is this poor communication. When we look at professional relationships, so in any job, in any industry, the book talks about how important it is to do this humble inquiry. And it's better to learn to ask questions because of how complex and culturally diverse our world is. We can't even hope to understand work with people from different occupations, professions, cultures, and we need to basically ask questions and build relationships that are built on mutual respect and the recognition of others and of other things, and recognizing that we need each other to get the job done. Think about the medical field. In a certain surgery, you have the surgeon, there is a technician, there's a nurse, anesthesiologist, there's all these different people. And if somebody notices that something's going wrong, you sure hope that they're going to speak up, but they won't if they don't feel like they can be open and share. So one of the reasons I kind of alluded to that we struggle with asking questions is that in school, like I said, based mainly in North America, everything's focused on finding the answers. The answer is the valuable thing, not the question. We're always looking how to get the answers for the next exam, for the test, to make sure we're getting it all right. The teacher asks a question, you got to know the answer. But when was the last time they taught you how to ask the question, right? Sometimes we need to ask the question to know how to answer. You'll see a lot of value placed on giving the answers maybe in the workplace. And if someone asks a dumb question, we look down upon that. Why? Why do we do that? When people don't know and they don't understand. So asking a question can be truly impactful. So why does this matter to me personally? I'm going to open up a little bit with you guys. So I hope that you guys can go along with my spiritual growth here. I started to realize when I started to think about this questioning and why questions are important, how I got there was I started to think I have the tendency to think worst case scenario, and a few people in this room can definitely be a witness to that and share. And maybe it's a protection tactic, or I'm like trying to just think of, worst case scenario. So when someone tells me something different, and it's different than I expect, I tend to think the worst, rather than asking more questions to understand better. Especially early on in my relationship, which was an interesting one, is I would come to these conclusions that weren't true. And why? I later figured out that I didn't have the courage to ask the questions, and then I ended up building this story that wasn't even real. And that's when I started to think. I realized that my lack of asking questions actually impacted those that were closest to me. And I went on a mission in my life to do better, to stop, to pause, to think, to ask why, how, and not just stop after one, like keep going. So I hope you'll go on this journey with me as I continue to learn how to ask questions. So I would ask myself, why would I avoid these questions? Why was I afraid of the answer? Rather than being open to hearing the answer, which is often different than I would expect. And I realized that my ego gets in the way. And my emotions take over, and then the logic goes out the window, and I end up being selfish instead of empathetic. So all of this to say again, I'm trying to learn and I'm trying to grow, and I want to use the Bible today to see how we can maybe learn about some communication styles. So before we go into getting some tips on how to ask questions, I wanted us to look at how Jesus communicated in general. So the first thing, there's 4 different elements I want to cover. So as we go along, I'm not going to read too many verses. I don't have any slides. So if you do have a Bible with you or on your phone, or if there's a Bible in the pew, please grab it, because we're going to be scanning a few of the examples. And that's why I asked Jacob Teshich to read a bunch of the verses so that you could hear that story and we won't repeat it. Okay, so the first element. So how many elements did I say we're going to go over? 4. Great, you're listening. 9? No. 4. If you have 5 more, I would love to hear it, actually, so you can find me later. Okay, the first element he used stories. The Bible calls them parables. So Jesus would use stories to tell and explain something, to teach us, to challenge us, to invite us to think. And there's over 40 parables or 40 stories actually mentioned in the gospel. I'm sure he used tons more. So let's look at one example together. Luke, in the book of Luke, chapter 10. So if you can turn with me, Matthew, Mark, Luke, so 3rd in the New Testament. Luke chapter 10. We're going to kind of skim through verses 25 to 37. I'll paraphrase a little bit so we know this story that's happening. I should go to the right page. Okay, there was a lawyer that came, and he asked Jesus, or the teacher, and he said, "What should I do to inherit eternal life?" And he says, "What is written in the law?" So Jesus responds with a question. He says, "What is written in the law? What is the reading of it?" And he says, the lawyer says, "You'll love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your strength, with all your soul, and you will love and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And then Jesus says, "You have answered rightly. Do this and you will live." And he, wanting to justify himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" And then Jesus responds, but he doesn't respond in the way we expect. He responds with a story. So I guess let's read it together. You can read it with me. Then Jesus answered and said, verse 30, "A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves who stripped him of his clothing, wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a certain priest came down the road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite, when he arrived at the place, came and looked and passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. So he went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and he set him on his own animal, brought him into an inn, and took care of him. On the next day, when he departed, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper and said, 'Take care of him. Whatever you spend, when I come again, I will repay you.' And then he asks him." So there's a few different people mentioned in this story. And the Samaritans, people from Samaria, did not have good relations with the Jewish people. So this lawyer, who was Jewish, was confused. Why would the Samaritan help this person? But Jesus asks them, "Then who of the 3 people that I told you was the neighbor?" And they said, "He who showed mercy on him." So almost like didn't even say the word Samaritan, which was interesting. And then Jesus said to him, "Okay, go and do the same. Do likewise." So Jesus uses this story to show the value of a person. It doesn't matter your status, doesn't matter where you are in like the working field or who you are, you're a person and you have value. And he shows the people that you even hate you have value, and he says, go and do the same. So why did Jesus use stories? This is just one example. There's tons of examples. I think he used it to help us think, to help put ourselves maybe in the story. And then when you put yourself in the story, it ends up being more real for you and makes it more impactful and meaningful. That then brings us to ACT. This one guy named Mick Mooney says, Jesus liked to share his thoughts through parables that required his audience actually to go away and figure out the answer. So the answers you will see are often missing. And he wants them to go and figure it out. And I think that is really significant thing to understand regarding how we learn from God. It's not about waiting for the answers, but rather we learn by daring to follow the questions that God stirs in our hearts. So I'll say that again. It's not about waiting for the answers, but daring to follow the questions that God puts in your heart. So that's the first element. He uses stories. Second element, he uses real-life situations. He uses those moments for teaching opportunities. He uses it to teach us a lesson, to provoke, to think about what truly matters, to think on things that are eternal, that aren't passing. And he teaches us about himself. He teaches about his character. He teaches about what the kingdom of God is actually like. So the people here were expecting Jesus to build this strong and powerful kingdom with a probably big fortress and all this stuff with might, because this is God. But he says, lots of examples in Matthew 13, if you want to go, and you can check it out as well. He says the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, or a merchant seeking for beautiful pearls. Or in 20, he says, the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who hired laborers. So suddenly they're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. There's no fortresses involved. There's no armies. There's no soldiers. What do you mean? What kind of kingdom is this? So he uses those moments to teach about what the kingdom is like. So the example that Jacob Tashich read was in Matthew 20. So I want to show you how he uses a real-life situation to communicate and teach a lesson. So let's turn to Matthew chapter 20, 20 to 28. I really like this example because James and John's mother comes to Jesus and asks a question, and then Jesus responds with the question. And he brings them to think about, again, they're thinking of what the kingdom is, right? So where are we? Verse 20 to 28. So, and then he goes, and then he says, in 22, you don't even know what you're asking. You don't even know what you're asking. Are you going to be able to take this cup of suffering? And he goes, actually, you will. But that's kind of not the point. And you kind of fast forward to verse, let's say, 26 to 28. When you look and you see, he's trying to get them to think about the kingdom a little bit differently. And he says, whoever desires to be first, you will be last. And he says, I came, who is the Creator, the Son of Man, to serve and to suffer and to be a ransom for many. So he starts to flip their worlds upside down by, they're talking about this kingdom, this real-life situation for them, and he's saying, the kingdom is all about humbleness and about being last, not first. So, again, totally revolutionary for them at the time. So another thing I also like about this part of the Bible is when he says to her, you don't even know what you're asking. And that made me think about, maybe this is a good thing for us to learn. If we don't understand, maybe we need to ask a few more questions and not just respond, but listen and be curious and ask more questions to see it more clearly. Okay, so he used stories, he used real-life situations. The third style I wanted to share that I noticed was he wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't rushing to leave people. Now, I'm not saying he wasn't full of action, because actually one time I preached here, I talked about how there's this word immediately, constantly used. Immediately he did this, immediately he did that. There's constant action, but he wasn't in a hurry. And how do we know this? So I thought about this. How do we know that he's not in a hurry? He made time for people that nobody made time for at that time. So for the children, they were not there was no time made for hanging out with the children. And he says, "Let the little children come to me," in verse 19, in Matthew 19. He hung out with people like the widows, the sick and the poor, and the tax collectors and the prostitutes. Again, people that they looked down on. How else do I know he wasn't in a hurry? When there was a storm on the boat, he was sleeping. And his fishermen, his disciples, were terrified and in a panic, but Jesus was sleeping in Matthew 8. And then he calmed the storm afterwards. When his friend Lazarus was sick, he actually didn't hurry to him. He was told that he was sick, and he came there after 2 days after he already died. And then we know that beautiful story of how he resurrected Lazarus from the dead. He actually says that he knows his purpose and mission when he's in the temple when he's 12 years old and his parents lose him. And he asks, "Why were you looking for me? You know I'm doing my Father's mission." So he was very aware of his purpose and mission and the timing, his Father's timing. And so he wasn't in a hurry. So why are we so hurried is the question that I ask. Why are we okay, get to the point. What are you trying to say here? What if we take a moment and think, what are they trying to say here? Maybe I can help myself understand by asking more questions. So we said stories. What was the second thing? Second element? Real life. Third? No hurry. Awesome. The fourth element I have, can you guess what I'm going to say? What's the fourth element? What style did he use? Love. Good guess, but no. What did you say? Did someone say? Asking questions. Great. Yes. So he teaches with questions. That's the fourth element of Jesus' communication style I wanted to share. So we already read in Luke 10, when we talked about the Samaritan, we see him get a question asked, he responds with a question, there's another question, and then the parable, right? There's another example I wanted to share. I think it was, John chapter 1. We can go there as well. So John chapter 1. Again, there's lots of questions, but we're only going to focus on some. And then, I'm going very slowly. Here we go. John chapter 1, verses 37 to 39. So there are a couple of disciples who heard him speak, and they followed Jesus. Then Jesus turned, and seeing them following, he said to them, "What do you seek, or what are you looking for?" And they said to him, "Rabbi," which is translated as teacher, "where are you staying?" And he said to them, "Come and see." And they came and saw where he was staying and remained with him that day. So Jesus asks them this question: what are you looking for? And that's something that I grabbed from this book called Curious, The Unexpected Power of a Question-Led Life. And I thought it was really interesting the way that they unpacked this question. And he said, it's such a simple but powerful question. What are you looking for? Think about it. The first question that Jesus asks those who would follow him, it's not about sin, about their brokenness, about their family, politics, history. It's not even a question about God or what we believe, or if we even believe in God or what God is like. It's actually a glimpse into showing us the heart of God. It's a question that also stops us to give a glimpse into ourselves. So what are you looking for? It's a stunning question, and it's simple and vexing all in one. Jesus does not tell them, he also doesn't tell them what they are looking for. or he doesn't even direct them to what they're looking for. He asks them, and by asking them, he leads them and us. We're all in a search for something. We're all in a quest. And Jesus invites their internal, unspoken reality brings it to the surface with this simple question. By asking them this simple question, he shows them that he's not into this systematic theology. There's not going to be a multiple choice exam of how to get to heaven. It's this simple question Jesus is offering these two people. He's offering conversation, engagement, relationship, thinking, wrestling, and soul awareness. So asking that simple question, he wants to unearth, to bring something out of us. And we cannot answer that question honestly without actually exploring our own heart and thinking about it a little bit. Another example is in Mark 8, which we won't read, but I'll tell you. Basically, he asks another question, and he says, "Who do you say that I am?" And then he says, he first says, "Who do they say that I am?" And they said, "Oh, you're like," actually, let's open there. Let's read it. I forget now what it said exactly. So let's go to Mark 8. There's a couple verses. Mark 8, 27 to 30. Okay, so Jesus asks them, the disciples, "Who do men say that I am?" Verse 28, he answered, "John the Baptist, but some say Elijah, and the others say one of the prophets." And then he asks them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered, "Well, you are the Christ." So again, he's inviting them to think and to he challenges them to make up your own mind. So this is what everyone else is saying, but what are you saying? What have you come to think? Do you know the truth for yourself? Are you looking at the truth in their example, right? So lots of these examples of questions, how Jesus asks questions. So I saw a really cool stat, actually, which is what inspired me even more to talk about this. In the book, they talk about it as well, in this one. He points out that in the Gospels, so the first 4 books of the New Testament, Jesus is actually asked 183 questions are recorded here. So I'm sure he was asked a ton more, but 183. Do you know how many he answers out of the 183? 1, 2, 3, yeah, like 3 or 4. So one book said 4, another book said 3. This is something that we'd have to inspect for ourselves, but only 4. So the other 179 questions, how do you think he responds to them? Stories with other questions, sometimes very cryptic remarks as well. Do you know how many questions Jesus asked others? So he was asked 183. How many questions do you think he asked? That was at least recorded. Someone said double? Yeah, almost double. 307. 307 questions. So in this book, he talks about how it's so easy for us to slide into this thinking that Jesus is interested in the answers and making sure that we have the right answers. But the reality is that it's different. He seems more interested in making sure that we are considering the right questions. So he's interested in ensuring that we're considering the right questions. Okay, so out of these 4 different communication styles today, I wanted us to continue to reflect on the question part, because we could literally talk about all 4 for weeks. I started to think about this. Why did Jesus ask so many questions? Like, don't you ask a question when you don't know the answer? Isn't that why you're asking questions? So I went, well, if Jesus is all-knowing and powerful, why did he ask questions? In other words, even if he knows all the answers, like, why is he asking all the questions? So I started to think a little bit about, well, if he was the perfect example of humility, humble people are actually not asked so many questions, but they end up asking a lot of questions. They seem to be the ones that are asking more, not because they hold the answer, but it's usually for a greater purpose. So it's not that he needed to know the answers for others to feel good. You don't need the answers to feel good. but because he loved talking to people and sharing and getting them to open up. He was more concerned about others. He was focused on others. He was focused on building a relationship. He wanted to give an opportunity to reflect, to think, to act, to relive it. Even when he was asked, you saw that example, he said, you don't even know what you're asking. So these humble people, like Jesus, if we're trying to be like Jesus, we need to ask more questions to understand what they're even asking. So even though Jesus is all-knowing, that doesn't necessarily matter to build that relationship. It's not how much you know, but how much you can help someone realize any topic. The fact that he's all-knowing is not going to necessarily move us to act, unfortunately. We have that example of the rich young ruler in Mark chapter 10. And he asks, what do I need to do to have eternal life? And he says, sell everything. And this man walked away sad because he had many things. So he's bringing us to think about other things that are above the material. And the questions are stirring us to think. So why not just give the answers? So one example I wanted to share is Jacob was telling me about this nutrition course, which I thought was really interesting that he was learning about. And he was telling me this example that you can be this nutritionist that's trying to give someone the best plan ever. And you're just like 100% knowledge plan. And you're trying to tell this person, it's the best. You're going to change your life with this plan. And the person says, like, you ask them, can you do it? And they're like, yeah, like 60%. Okay, that's pretty good. Like, you're going to change your whole life by 60%. That's pretty good. What if you took a different approach and you said, okay, what can you do? What are those things that you could do? And they start telling you all the things that you can do. And guess what? They're actually 80% there. That's pretty good. And you ask them, can you do it? Oh yeah, 100%. I'm going to do it. For sure can do it. And they want to prove themselves right, so they're going to make sure this happens. So you have the first scenario, which it's 100% plus them 60% compliant with it, so 160. Or you have the second version, which is an 80% plan and 100% compliance, but you're 180%, right? Or 180. It's better than 160. So it's not necessarily having that best answer. It's the best action, right? And that comes with understanding, and then you'll have buy-in, and then you'll be able to heal and grow. So Jesus doesn't just give us the answers all the time. He gives us a part in this. And we're usually more likely to do something if we come up with it on our own, rather than if someone says, you have to do this, and you have to do that, and you have to do this. Less likely you're going to do it, right? All right, so what can we learn from Jesus' communication style? He asked a lot of questions. He taught more with questions than answers. He actually didn't ask when, but he asked more like why and how. He listened. He showed he cared. He was curious. He had a foundation of love. I heard someone say love earlier. Even when he was challenged or he was challenging them. He challenged with thought. He was brave. He knew the truth. He knew the scripture. He also didn't rush. So what are ways that we can communicate better? I have 7 different tips. So we can listen, acknowledge, and actually hear. How many times is someone talking to you and you're already formulating what you're going to say next, right? But it actually takes, the book calls it a holy pause. You almost have to stop and say, all I'm focusing on is what they're saying, right? And so listen and acknowledge. Don't just listen to respond. Practice humility and care. We talked about that humble inquiry. And he defines it as the fine art of drawing someone out, of asking questions which you don't know the answer to already. That's built on curiosity and actual interest in the other person. Another thing we talked about with the scenario in the beginning with the mushrooms was do less telling and more asking. So thinking about how are we asked, sometimes even though you ask the question, you're still kind of telling them what you think. You know what I mean? Like you're saying the question without actually caring. You just kind of want them to say what you're thinking. So how can we be more curious and interested by less telling and more asking? The fourth one, be patient. Don't rush. Sometimes you end up hearing the same story over and over again, which is okay, because look how excited that person is. It happened yesterday. My parents just came back. I heard the stories from mom. Then I heard the stories from dad. They don't know this, but I was happily smiling and just excited to hear them share their excitement, right? And sometimes we can just smile and nod and notice that this person is so excited to tell you something. And are we in that moment, or are we completely missing it by saying, I already heard it from mom yesterday? But thankfully I'm learning, and I'm trying not to do that. Okay, the other one was, I kind of mentioned it already, this term, but taking a holy pause. So I think one of the ways that we can actually ask better questions is you have to ask yourself questions and actually think about what you think and what your answer is. So take the time to reflect and answer the questions yourself to be able to ask others as well. Number 6 was having follow-up questions to help you understand the situation. It's totally fair that you might not know what they're saying with one question. Like, there's lots more you can ask. And the number 7, the tip is practice, practice, practice. Reflect on this, notice it. Take those moments to notice and give yourself grace as you're learning, because we're not gonna learn it in one go. Okay, before I conclude, are you guys up for a little exercise? Not physical, mental. Does that work? You can do physical too. All right, so I have a couple of questions on the screen that I thought it'd be really fun to put, so I hope you're listening. I gave you a bunch of tips. I gave you 7. I gave you 4 different communications, the elements of communication. And I want you to pick one question for yourself and get into groups of 2 or 3 and ask the other person the question. And I helped with giving you a little bit of starters. Maybe I can read them out loud just in case it's too small for some people. But I want you to ask the question to the other person and ask more than just the question that I gave you, or choose your own question, whatever you want. But I want you to be curious and patient and ask each other the questions. And I'm gonna give you about 5 minutes to do this, and then we'll come back and wrap up. So, number 1, if you adopted a more question-led approach to your interactions with others, how would that help you? And how would that change your relationships? Number 2, how would you answer that question that Jesus asked? What are you looking for? Number 3, is there anything that anywhere in your life that Jesus is responding to the questions you are asking in your heart with an invitation to come and see? Like we saw earlier where he asks, what are you looking for? And then he tells them, come and see. Number 4, if you're a leader, or if you influence others, or if you work with other people, do you ever feel the pressure to know the answers? Maybe you don't even know them. How would you respond, and why do you respond that way? And number 5, are there any needs that you see in your community? And is there some way you can do something about it? So I wanted to choose a diverse set of questions, so whatever maybe piques your interest, you can talk about it. So let's try and keep it a little quieter, but if you can get into groups of 2s or 3s, try and ask some questions, and we'll come back and wrap up in 5 minutes. Does that work? Is it clear? Makes sense? And I know it's a short amount of time, and I purposely did it short so that you can continue for the whole day afterwards, okay? Okay, go ahead, and we'll come back in 5. I'll time us. Okay. Amazing. Thank you all so much for being part of this exercise with me. Hopefully it woke us up a bit too. Who asked at least one question? Put your hand up. Okay, who asked more than one question? Okay, a few. Okay, no time, right? We need to do it. David, how many questions did I ask you? Yeah, I think I asked you like 6 or 7, but thank you for answering all my questions. It was very interesting. If you learned something today in your experience of asking questions or about the other person, I would love to hear it. So if you want to tell me, come find me later. If you learned about something, I would love to hear it. And that will help me grow even more. Okay, so I hope that this element of curiosity and care continues for the rest of our day. And I read this really cool quote from another book called 307 Questions that Jesus asked. And it said, "The goal is not to communicate knowledge, but to elicit new understanding in the listener. Information is not the goal. Transformation is." So transformation can be a really beautiful thing. And I thought it'd be fun to kind of end with a story. I'm kind of learning from the way that Zoran preaches. I really like that he ends with stories. And I found this cool story, and I wanted you guys to think about this, like what your purpose is and what we're trying to do. Is transformation exciting to you? Are people exciting to you? What's your purpose? So to show this example, I have a story of this legend that was once told. So there was a young squire, and he was in the service of a knight. Okay, so there's a squire and a knight. These are people like soldiers. People are asking, what are knights? What's a knight? How can I explain what a knight is? What's a squire? Vitas. What's a squire? Does anyone know? It's like a student of the, so he's like a student of the knight. Okay. So there's a knight and there's a young squire. And the squire's lifelong ambition is to someday be like this knight. And through the years, the knight trains the squire in his techniques of battle and of weaponry. Being young, the squire is impatient and he's prone to ask the knight if he, the squire, is ready to officially be a knight. Tiring of these questions, of these repeated questions, the great knight sends his squire into the hills to seek out an old sage, like a wise person, who had once been the greatest knight of all. The squire finds the sage and announces what he wants, to become a knight. The sage silently leads the squire to a lake, where they board a boat and they set out. But when they reach the lake's center, the sage instructs the squire to get in the water. A little dubiously, the squire jumps into the frigid cold water. But before this young boy can emerge, the sage takes his hand and he reaches in the water and grabs the squire's head. But he holds him under. And he says the squire is kicking furiously and grabbing and trying to grab his hand, and no luck. Seconds feel like minutes that are passing by, and finally the sage, he finally lets go of the fight, and the sage brings the boy back to the boat. And the squire is furious, and he's saying, "I need an explanation." And then the sage calmly provides, "When I had you under, what was going on in your mind?" And the squire thought for a moment, and his anger kind of relaxing, and he said, "Air. I thought, air, I need air, otherwise I'll die. That's all I was thinking." So the sage replied, "There you have it then, young squire. When you want to be a knight as badly as you want air, then you'll become one." So figuring out what that is not a small task. Figuring out what that air is for us is not a little thing. But I think we can work, reflect, and try and figure out, what is that air for us? What does that look like? And maybe questions can help us get there. So do we want relationship the way that this young squire wanted air? Do we want it that desperately? So I'm going to end with this question. Can we communicate like Jesus? You let me know. Amen.